Well, I'm sitting here in a reconstruction of Charles Ives's office. I wondered how it was going to make me feel. It's not nearly as dramatic as the time I went to the Yale Library and ordered a box by number, and they brought out the box and I lifted out of it the manuscript of the Concord Sonata. That was the actual paper Ives wrote it on. That was overwhelming. I thought it might be kind of a Raiders of the Lost Ark moment, like light would come with the manuscript and my face would melt or something, but I think I heard angels singing. And that must have been about 10 years ago, 2013 or something, and I had been involved with that piece since I was 13, since about 1969, I guess. So I started reading when I was 4, and the first novel I read, I must have been 5 or 6, was Little Men by Louisa May Alcott, and I was just totally enchanted by it. And then I read the prequel, Little Women, then I read the sequel, Joe's Boys, and then I read Rose and Bloom and Eight Cousins and Jack and Jill. And I would get these books at the library and sneak them into my backpack so that the Texas bullies who followed me around wouldn't beat the crap out of me if they found me reading this stuff. So, and pretty soon after that, I started reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. And by 11 or 12, I was dipping into Walden, and my mom had a book of Ralph Waldo Emerson essays, and I grew up in a classical music household. My mother was a piano teacher. My father sang a little bit. He was an accountant. And when I was 12, I asked my mom why weren't there any recent American composers, because everything was Mozart and Rachmaninoff and Schubert and all that. And she said, well, I think there are. She named Roy Harris and Charles Ives. And she had the Joseph Machlis book on contemporary music heavily underlined all through it. And I read that, and it said that Charles Ives had written a sonata based on Emerson, Hawthorne, the Alcotts, and Thoreau. And I think my head spun around like the girl in The Exorcist or something. I had to go get the record, John Kirkpatrick II recording with the old Manson on the cover, and I took it home and I listened to it. And there's lots and lots of notes and everything, and every now and then they go da 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 da. And so I put it on again. And there's lots and lots of notes and go da 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 every now and then. And I was determined I was not going to fail to understand this piece of music. I remember I got The Rite of Spring about the same time, and The Rite of Spring had a little more I could hold on to. The Rite of Spring was not quite as tricky as the Concord Sonata, but I kept listening to it and finally worked my way into it. I was so fascinated by the subject. I was so close to what the piece was about already that I went to Whittle Music in Dallas and bought for $6 this old copy of the score to the Concord Sonata, which is all stained and falling apart. And I was a pretty good pianist in high school. I'm not much better than I am now. And so I learned to play the Alcotts and Thoreau. I was never in much danger of playing Emerson. That was a little beyond me. I never really expected to write much about Charles Ives. There was so much scholarship going on about him. And in the late 80s, I really disliked what was being written about him. There was this revisionist attempt to try to make it look like he had gotten everything from Europe models, and everything was connected to this weird relationship with his father and everything. And for years, I refused to read anything about Ives. I didn't like what they were saying about him, and I just stayed away from them. And then some publisher sent me Jan Swafford's biography of Charles Ives. And I kind of looked at it and said, all right, and I put it down. It must have sat there for months. And one day I picked it up and started reading in the middle, and I read it to the end, and then I started the beginning and read it to the middle. And I was so happy that someone understood Charles Ives the way I did. Because Jan is a very good composer. I think he had the same kind of sympathy. And it restored my faith in writing about Ives. And then Neely Bruce asked me, knowing of my enthusiasm for Ives, asked me to give a keynote address for the Festival of All Ives Complete Songs being sung in Middletown. And so I was very, very honored by that. Very scared to stand up in front of all these Ives scholars and try to say something new. And after that, Neely asked me to, or I got asked as a result of that, to join the Ives Society, which was another tremendous honor. And once I was in the Ives Society, I started thinking, well, here I have all this access to all this Ives material. Maybe I should write something about Ives myself. Maybe I should set the record straight. And I got the idea of writing a book on the Concord Sonata, which had been, I'm not sure the Concord is my favorite Ives work. I think my favorite might be the Third Symphony, actually. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece, but a very, very difficult piece to write about. And the Concord is much easier to write about, but it had never been analyzed, because it was a very difficult piece to analyze, and I consider myself basically able to analyze anything. And so I got the idea of, I taught a course in the Concord Sonata and used that as to get some ideas for it. And then I started going to the Yale Library pretty regularly to look at the manuscripts, and with a magnifying glass and transcribing every note and everything. It was fabulous. I didn't need to. Actually, I'm going to cut in and tell one story. But in 1991, I taught a course in American music at Brooklyn College. And the night before my first class, I had a dream that I was with a bunch of people waiting to see Charles Ives. And he came out and he selected me and he brought me over to the piano and played some stuff for me and everything. And that dream, going to Brooklyn College to teach about American music after that dream, what made it was an entirely different experience. It was like Charles Ives came to me in a dream. I didn't need to do any advocacy for the Concord Sonata. I have 45 recordings of the Concord Sonata, and there are a lot of others I couldn't find. It's speculated that it has been the most widely played, or at least widely recorded, 20th century piano work. I wouldn't know how to prove that. But one thing I did want to do in the book was rehabilitate the reputation of Ives's essays before a sonata. Because I read that book when I was 15, and it's a crazy book. Very uneven, can't always tell what Ives is trying to get at, but the rhetoric is kind of thrilling, and it meant a lot to me in my youth. And in recent decades, the book has been really kind of denigrated and soft-pedaled and pushed aside in the Ives world, I think unfairly. And so I really wanted to go through that book. First of all, it had a reputation that none of Ives's quotations were exact. And that's been said in book after book. And so I took Ives's quotations, put them in Google. They just came up like that. Ives's quotations were not incorrect. Howard Boatwright just couldn't find them, and he blamed Ives instead of blaming him. Some of them were in plain sight. One of them was a poem at the beginning of one of Emerson's most famous essays. I let Boatwright off pretty easy in the book, but he should have found some of these things. And he should not have made a statement that Ives's quotations were never literal enough to find them. That was ridiculous. It's too bad he didn't have Google. I found everything Ives quoted. There was virtually nothing that didn't come up in a quick search. So, and secondly, there is an argument, the argument that runs through especially the Emerson essay and the epilogue, made a lot more sense to me than it has to some people. For one thing, some people have disliked Ives's rhetoric because he was trained to write by being an insurance salesman, and he wrote insurance salesman pamphlets. I have never minded Ives's kind of colloquial style. And even some of his punchy, good night shirt and all that, all this old slang that nobody knows what it means anymore. And I've always found that kind of fascinating about him. I mean, he was not a highbrow in the sense he mentions in the book. He had been a baseball player, as a football player, and yet he played Mendelssohn's first organ sonata, which is a really difficult piece, on a public recital when he was 15 years old. He was a really sophisticated musician. One of the things you find in Ives's sketches sometimes, like with the Thoreau movement, this is probably not visible on camera, but you find these places in his manuscripts where he'll just put down a jumble of different ideas that are unrelated. Especially true of the first piano sonata. There's a whole big section like this. He would just write down a bunch of disconnected ideas, and you look at them and they don't go together. There's no continuity, but you recognize all these things, and when you look at the finished version of the Thoreau movement, everything in that initial sketch gets used, and he moves it all around. And he repeats things often enough that you get used to them. He fleshes out the continuity, and everything on that incoherent little sketch ends up in the finished piece. And we know Ives had a great belief in the subconscious. He talks about in the Postface 114 songs about music coming from the subconscious. And you can tell when he'll read a newspaper and there'll be a little poem like quaint name and street, width of same 10 feet. And then all of a sudden these tumultuous chords come to his mind, and he starts, and it was a very subconscious influence. And you can tell that when he comes up with these subconsciously, with all of these little things that don't seem to go together, but he's going to make them go together. And that making them flow into each other convincingly is a tremendous feat of compositional technique. And there are still stupid people today who think of Ives as a musical amateur. No musical amateur performs the Mendelssohn First Organ Sonata at 15. At 13, he was the youngest professional organist in the state of Connecticut. Incredible musical mind. One of the things I do in my book that I think shows his part of his capacity is the comparisons between the 1920 and 1947 versions of the Concord Sonata. Every change he made was an improvement. He knew what he was doing, and every little problem in the original version he fixed. I think when he published it himself in 1920, he had no idea how much attention he was going to get. He thought maybe nobody'd ever look at it. It varied, and for the first few months, the only feedback he got was negative. And then by the time he had to republish it in 1947, he knew how to fix it. I think the basic point of Essays Before a Sonata can be boiled down to his idea at the end. He says, what has sound got to do with music? Maybe what music sounds like isn't what it is. And he basically ends up saying that it's possible that there might be a great piece of music and nobody would understand it, which I think must have been very much the position he felt he was in. And the idea that you could not judge the quality of a piece by the reception of it. He goes through this whole history of composers like Rossini who were considered really great, and then their reputation went down, and then Wagner kind of did the same thing. And talks about all the reasons that superficial careers can be made in the arts, but that what makes a piece great is the intensity the artist felt while creating it, and that might not come across, which is a pretty radical view and maybe not very utilitarian in terms of the art world, but it does, I think, suggest that there should be some kind of humility in the face of works of art we don't understand. And in his case, the Concord Sonata eventually did gain an audience, but he could have, if he had died in 1925, he might have died thinking it hadn't, that it had completely failed, that like Melville and Moby Dick, that nobody had paid attention. So anyway, I think there is an important argument laid out in Essays Before a Sonata that has not been much acknowledged. It is not very linearly made. Ives is very discursive. It's very much like his music. There are places in the Concord Sonata where you'll see something and you'll say, oh, why did he do that? And then 7 pages later, you'll say, oh, now I see why he did that back there. So there's one of my favorite examples is there's a motive called the tolerance motive in the Concord Sonata, da 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 da, and he called it the tolerance motive because it's played in 3 keys at once. It's played in clusters, and so he said that was played, and so it illustrated Emerson's tolerance. And at the end of the piece, towards the end of the piece, it doesn't come back. That theme doesn't come back in the second half of the Emerson movement. But what he does do at one point, there's a little tune that goes da 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 da, and Kirkpatrick asked him if that was the retrograde of the first theme, and Kirkpatrick said he looked like a little boy who had been caught doing something wrong, and he just kind of nodded. There's a little hidden retrograde of that theme in the second half. So it's funny, my own music is not very Ivesian. I am rather dedicated to clarity in my own music. Partly just because I think that's a more interesting thing to do now than it was in 1911 when I started the Concord Sonata. But another formative thing in my youth, I must have been about 14, I got a score to the 3 places in New England. Second movement, the orchestra splits up. Half the orchestra is playing 4/3 as fast as the other half. They've got 2 separate 4 beats going on at the same time. Nicholas Slanimsky used to conduct them differently with each hand. It's hard to do. And I looked at that. Looked at that and heard that, and I said, "That's what I'm going to do the rest of my life." And that has been the guiding idea of my music up till the present day. The pieces I'm working on right now I love the feel of things going on as though they are independent of each other. And that came from that moment of recognition looking at that score. about 1970, I think. Well, you know, the thing of having the two different orchestras at different tempos, you know, connects up all too easily with Thoreau's marching to a different drummer. I mean, it's that. And in fact, my favorite sentence in Essays Before a Sonata is, Thoreau was a great musician, not because he played the flute, but because he didn't have to go to Boston to hear the symphony. It's just... And I've always rather blamed John Cage for not picking up on that. John Cage should have grabbed that sentence and said, "Yeah, this is right where I'm going," and he didn't. Don't know why. I think Ives became a little too famous during Cage's career, too late in Cage's career, and Cage didn't want the competition or something. He was never very generous to Ives. Even though one of his best friends, Lou Harrison, was Ives's copyist, and Lou always referred to Ives as Mr. Ives. It was never Charles Ives. He was tremendously lucky to have a father of such eccentric musical proclivities. I don't think that's the whole story. I think a lot of people could have been born to George Ives and still not do what Charles Ives did. I think he just had an amazingly spontaneous imagination and a connection to his subconscious that nobody else could have done. It's been difficult for the musicologists to work Ives into some kind of narrative because at the time, you look at the early modernist composers, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Schoenberg talks about how all musical change must progress incrementally, that we have to, we try a little bit here and there to add to the tradition. And Ives was a composer, and not the only composer around, who didn't want change to be incremental. He wanted to churn everything up all at once. And there had always been these composers who had other ideas about music. I mean, Beethoven's friend Anton Reicha wrote pieces in 7/4 meter and an orchestra piece in 5/8. He was the first one to use a quarter tone line in one of his operas. Franz Liszt talked about using quarter tones. There were all these, it's not like no one had ever suggested doing all these things before. And Ives, along with, I like to think of Matthijs Vermeulen and the Dutch composer, and Kaikosur Sorabji as being sort of similar at the same time, did not want to change music incrementally. He had all these ideas that he wanted to work in right away. And so that was not, and the whole historiography of the first half of 20th century music was gradual change. And Ives did not fit into that. And he was suspect because of it. He was suspicious for having tried to change, worked on too many fronts at once. He did not, it's like in academia where they expect every scholar to add one brick to the building of knowledge. And if you go out and build a whole house somewhere, they think you're not serious. You're measured by the modesty of your innovations, And Ives's innovations were not modest. The musicologists who liked Ives's music in the 80s did a complete turnaround and tried to prove that Ives had taken everything from European sources. So he wasn't suspicious. He was actually sounded like the Liszt Piano Sonata or something, which I think is rather bizarre. But there's also been an undervaluation of Ives's early music because the First Symphony, everybody talks about the influence of Dvorak on it. First Symphony holds up awfully, awfully well for me. I think it is obviously the best symphony any American had written by that point. Holds up much better than the Chadwick symphonies or the Payne symphonies, Bristow. And he wrote it as a senior at Yale, or started as a senior, and remarkably good piece. And as Peter Burkhalter has shown, it was a very, very original approach to form. He studied Brahms and Tchaikovsky, and Dvorak, but he did not limit himself to what they were doing. He played around with phrase structure, tonality. Parker made him rewrite the second movement because he said it hogged all the keys at one meal. And one of the most touching things in Ives' whole life, I think, is in 1943, he went into a recording studio. He was recording excerpts, mostly from Emerson stuff, the Emerson studies. But one of the things he played was the original form of the second movement of the First Symphony. Now, this is 47 years later, but it's like he still had that piece in his head, and he wanted to prove Parker wrong or something. He made light of his early, more romantic music, but that piece meant a lot to him, and he wanted the original form out there. I think a really telling moment in his life. In the essays before Sonata, he talks about how the way we perceive the world, we get all of these fragments, and you try to fit them into a system. And if you do that without getting enough evidence, your system will be false and too limited. And it's a very turn of the century philosophical explosion, like with Bergson and William James and all these people. And so much other early 20th century music is about system and symmetry. And they invented atonal music, and they got scared by it. So they invented the 12-tone row. And you get all these symmetrical systems, and especially, I hate the number 12. It's just so closed. And the folding the 12 tones back over themselves like that and everything. You get a lot of that with Scriabin. You get it, of course, with Schoenberg, Weber, and Berg. And you even get it with Stravinsky. You'll have with the octatonic scale. And none of that seemed open enough to me. Ives' music was so open, it was so heterogeneous. And if one thing that I have become convinced of from teaching 20th century analysis for decades now is that the composers who were heterogeneous in their sources, who used anything that come to mind, like Messiaen, Ives, Cage, were ultimately more interesting than the ones who tried to derive everything from a single principle. And I find my students much, much more accepting of the music that will just do anything you want, and instead of like Webern trying to take 3 notes and derive the entire piece from it. It just seems less interesting. At the same time, Ives exploded at a very different point in history. I came along right after minimalism, and we were trying to reach audiences again who had been scared away by 12-tone music, basically. And so one of the things we figured out from minimalism was that in a minimalist context, doing those kind of rhythm, doing those kind of tempo complexes in a minimalist context made them much easier to hear. And so that became the basis for a lot of New York music in the 1980s and 90s, and it looks back to Ives's tempo experiments, and also Henry Cowell's, because Henry Cowell, in the rhythm chapter of New Musical Resources, had outlined all these possibilities for doing what Ives was doing. This is before he knew Ives was doing it, but in terms of having different tempos going at the same time. And so there's actually, I think, a strong continuity between that American experimentalism before World War II and minimalism afterward, because minimalism gave a context in which what those experimental composers were doing could be clearly heard. And so I guess that is the aspect of Ives, that is the route that Ives took into my own music. Because, a lot of people who were doing rhythmic complexity, often you couldn't hear it because it was just, there was no steady beat. And we reintroduced the steady beat so you could hear the complexity.